By mid-February, the German army was ready to begin its assault on Verdun. Since the beginning of the year, a continuous stream of German troops and artillery had choked the roads that formed the approach to this French fortress on the Meuse River. The Germans had massed 1 million soldiers against a defending French force of 200,000 troops, with the idea that a prolonged siege would draw in the remaining bulk of the French army spread over the Western Front. The German general, von Falkenhayn, was convinced that the back of the French army could be broken through attrition, leaving a clear path for the Kaiser's troops to march on Paris and thus bring an end to the war. If mankind had endeavored to create a hell on earth, he couldn't have pulled it off more effectively than he did at Verdun. The battle began on February 21st with a massed bombardment. 1,400 artillery pieces, arrayed along an 8-mile front, began a barrage that dropped nearly 100,000 shells per hour on Verdun throughout the first day of the siege. Woods and buildings were blasted to splinters, trenches obliterated, the earth churned to a wasteland, and countless thousands of men simply vanished forever under the assault of high explosives. When the German attackers climbed from their trenches and advanced across no man's land the following morning, they found stiff resistance offered by French troops who'd survived the bombardment. In addition, an extra division of soldiers had been sent piecemeal to man the front lines during the barrage. Still, the sheer bulk of the German force allowed them to make some initial gains, painfully grinding forward until by the third day of battle they occupied the French second trench line. It was here that the defenders held their ground and the real horror began. The battle for Verdun would continue on for the next 10 months, a series of sieges and counter-sieges that would result in the wholesale slaughter of nearly 1 million men. 1 million men sacrificed for a piece of real estate occupying a scant 10 square miles of ground. More than any other World War I action, Verdun would come to epitomize the futility and waste that characterized the war. The French had reached a critical moment with the Battle of Verdun. If their line broke, the German plan to break the back of the French army would succeed, and Paris would ultimately fall. At the onset of the siege, French reconnaissance airplanes had been denied access to the skies over the battlefield, and the defenders were forced to fight blindly without the benefit of aerial intelligence. The relatively small force of the Fokker pilots, led by the great German ace Oswald Boelcke, ensured that no French machine was able to operate over Verdun airspace. Realizing that air supremacy must be secured over the enemy, 24 French squadrons were pulled from the north and relocated to operate from airfields behind Verdun. Equipped with the excellent Nieuport Scout, including the newer improved Nieuport 17, 5 new escadrilles de chasse were formed and rushed into battle. The famous Storks Escadrille, still under the capable leadership of Felix Brocard, was expanded to include an additional 3 squadrons, and together these 4 escadrilles formed France's first Groupe de Chasse. Brocard, now responsible for an entire combat group, stepped up his search for the most gifted and talented flyers at his country's disposal. As the terrible slaughterhouse on the ground churned on, the courage and skill of the French pilots became legendary as they took the air war on the offensive. Soon, a handful of French flyers began to emerge as aces, and the overwhelming superiority of the Fokker Eindeckers finally came to an end. 2 pilots who would distinguish themselves as members of the Storks were Captains Alfred Hurto and René Dorm. Before being invited to join Les Seconds, Hurto had achieved the distinction of shooting down an enemy airplane with just 1 bullet. A colorful character, Hurto often amused himself in battle by thumbing his nose and making otherwise obscene gestures at the German pilots he fought. He felt that by showing this contempt, he could increase the enemy's hatred and hopefully drive them to the point where blind fury would overcome their sense of caution. René Dorm, on the other hand, established himself as a no-nonsense flyer who strove to master all aspects of the Nieuport he flew. He could recover from a spin with no more than a quarter turn of his plane, and taking no chances, involved himself in all facets of the machine's maintenance on the ground. An exciting rivalry quickly developed between Hurto and Dorm as their scores increased side by side above the gruesome slaughterhouse of Verdun. After downing 6 German machines in the space of a single week, Hurto jumped ahead of Dorm and was to hold this lead until he finally met his death in combat a year later. Another gifted Frenchman who made a name for himself over Verdun was Jean-Marie Nevers. Described as an angular-faced, dark-eyed collection of nervous energy, Nevers was the son of a wealthy paper manufacturer who'd taken up flying as a hobby before the outbreak of war. Originally serving in MS-12, he was eventually posted to N-67, a brand new chase escadrille formed around the Newport Baby, and hurried into battle at Verdun. Determined to lay waste to the myth of the Fokker invincibility, Nevers threw himself into the battle with a ferocity that unnerved even his own squadron mates. By the end of his first month at Verdun, he had achieved ace status, and as April arrived, with his longer daylight hours, Nevers took to flying 5 or 6 patrols each day. Whenever possible, Nevers would fly alone, and by the beginning of June, his score stood at 12 victories. While the younger pilots in the squadron idolized Nevers, his commanding officers were less than pleased with his disdain for authority and regulations. He often had the habit of abandoning formations to go off alone after German machines he spotted, and on the ground refused to file his combat reports and other paperwork expected of him. On more than one occasion, Nevers was placed under open arrest, and each time he'd return to combat even wilder and more undisciplined than before. On June 17th, while attacking an Aviatik two-seater, Nevers was hit by a machine gun burst that left him dizzy with shock. Weak from the loss of blood, he managed to get his Newport back to his own lines and onto the ground before passing out. Already something of an eccentric, Nevers had slipped into a deep depression and was now prone to violent outbursts of temper. When eventually discharged from the hospital, he spent his convalescence in Paris. The sight of the stooped, metal-bedecked figure carrying a cane became a painful sight at the restaurants and bistros in that city, as he systematically set out to drown himself in alcohol. Something had snapped in Jean-Marie Nevers, and his self-destructive behavior increased to the point that he was committed to a sanitarium, where he would spend the next 2 years.